Welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Ashford. I'm Director of Energise Africa, one of the UK's leading impact investing platforms, which is a joint venture between FX in the UK and Lender Hand in the Netherlands. Welcome to the Breakout Africa Summit 2022. We've got a wonderful session today on blended finance. We're looking at scaling investment in sustainable businesses in the global south. I've got a brilliant panel with me today. We're going to be presenting to you our thoughts around blended finance, and then we will be splitting into three breakout groups to deep dive into some of these subjects in more detail. So we'll be looking at innovative blended finance approaches to de-risking emerging market investments. We'll be looking at the developing affordable local currency and USD lending mechanisms for accessibility to many more businesses in emerging economies, and also carbon finance and the catalytic role that that has in underpinning lending to sustainable businesses. So you will be randomly allocated to a group at the end of our presentations. If for whatever reason you would prefer to be in another group, you can send yourself back into the main room again and you can be reallocated. We do have scribes from Energize Africa who will be in each of the sessions. And if someone could also nominate themselves as the sort of chair of the group, that would be helpful, because we'll be having some feedback and summing up at the end of the session. So we'll start off with the presentations from each of the panel members. So I'd like to just introduce, they'll be fully introducing themselves shortly, but just very quickly, if you could give me a wave as I introduce you. So as I mentioned, my name's Lisa Ashford from Energize Africa. We'll be having Claire Gnocchi from Convergence, John Lane from the Carbon Trust, Sarbinder Singh from P4G, Shahid Mian from Energize Africa, Per van der Sway from TCX, and Johannes van der Ven from Good Energies Foundation. And after each of these 5-minute presentations, we'll have a good Q&A session. So please do submit your questions via the chat function if you would like to, or you can verbally do that at the end of the sessions. I'll give you a prompt on that. So thanks very much again for being here, and let's kick off. So Claire, if you'd like to start us off today, you can share your screen and that would be wonderful. Over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, for the warm welcome. It is great to be on this panel. So I hope you can all see my screen, currently sharing it. Perfect, great. So I'm Claire Gnocchi, an associate within the Africa Region Office of Convergence, where blended finance is our bread and butter. Convergence is a global network for blended finance, and we generate blended finance data, intelligence, and deal flow just to increase private sector investment into developing countries. So it's such an honor to be part of this panel with friends of Convergence, and I'm quite pleased to see an audience full of people and institutions that are doing a great job in different ways towards the achievement of the SDGs. So I know the definition for blended finance is a bit nuanced. So I'll just kick it off by briefly sharing that as I speak of blended finance and this form of structuring today, I'll be referring to the use of catalytic capital from public and philanthropic sources just to increase private sector investment in emerging markets. And just an overall look of the overall blended finance market. And this is pulled from the data that we as Convergence pull, especially for our State of Blended Finance report. We have looked at 5,300 financial commitments with an aggregate value of over $160 billion. These are commitments to over 650 closed blended finance transactions globally, with over 40% of these actually being in the climate-related transactions. And most of these climate-related transactions, as we'll see on the next slide, have targeted climate mitigation, specifically renewable energy and energy efficiency, with a smaller subset targeting subsectors such as the sustainable agriculture. And looking at expected trends for 2022, which we've also highlighted on a blog that highlights 5 blended trends that we expect in 2022, we do see that climate finance will continue to represent a significant market for blended finance, including adaptation activities, which have an estimated need of $180 billion per year through to 2030, and historically have seen a lot less activity than mitigation activities. And we also acknowledge that there's a significant need to scale investments in climate finance. And the good news is that Convergence has observed an uptick in the sector since 2018, including several adaptation finance subsectors such as climate smart agriculture, as well as land and marine resource management. And we're also seeing more coordinated action from institutional investors in the sector. As an example, COP26, so the pioneering of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, a global coalition of leading financial institutions, including banks and asset managers, who have committed over $130 trillion of capital to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And right up the alley of some of the things that we're doing as Convergence, we will be collaborating with the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance this year, just to increase the members' access to development finance and blended finance transactions, seeking private capital, as well as to increase direct collaboration between the Alliance members and the official development finance community. And we recognize that climate is a nascent sector, which signals that there's a lot of potential for innovation. I, however, think of innovation with regard to sectors and region, rather than trying to establish complex structures that investors will have a difficult time understanding and investing in. We therefore should be thinking of replication and scale while customizing solution to the uniqueness of each targeted region. And we also acknowledge that while blended finance holds significant potential just to crowd in additional capital to achieve the SDGs, these transactions can be complex, time-intensive, as well as highly costly to structure and launch. So therefore, funding is often needed early on just to support the design and structuring of transactions that may otherwise be too risky to pursue. And this is where design funding comes in, and can be very useful for supporting the development of blended finance solutions in frontier markets and nascent sectors, such as climate, which is what we'd want to see on the innovation front. And I just want to say that as Convergence, we do see a lot of potential for design funding to catalyze additional investment in the sector. And just to briefly talk through the theory of change, grant capital provided through design funding gives critical support early on to teams that are developing investment concepts for products that they're looking to take to market. This eventually leads to transactions reaching the market that otherwise may not have, therefore contributing to just building this market and ultimately catalyzing additional investment to the sector. So models in the market sends a signal to investors that these transactions are happening and are viable. As investor demand increases, deal sponsors have a better indication and potential of some of the things that investors will be potentially interested in, and potential investors for the new investment structures are now able to identify what they can invest in. So therefore, just leading to the propagation of more deals. And as I wind up, I'd just like to note that as Convergence, we do identify the potential of early stage design funding grants, and we are actually trying to support some of these scalable initiatives through our design funding program. So we currently have 3 open design funding windows that are aligned to climate action. And these are the Indo-Pacific Design Funding Window, which is funded by the Australian government. We do have the Asia Natural Capital Design Funding Window that's funded by a family office, that's the RS Group. And we recently launched a Global Gender Responsive Climate Finance Window that's funded by Global Affairs Canada. And just to conclude, we need more of this tailored patient capital if scalable solutions in this sector actually to come to fruition. So more organizations, especially public and philanthropic institutions, just need to be a bit more nimble, flexible, and dare I say daring enough just to provide solutions such as early stage funding and risk mitigation tools needed to make transactions bankable and also reduce the costs to end users, say by lowering tariffs in energy transactions. So we just need to learn from what has worked, think about how we can replicate, improve, customize these solutions instead of trying to reinvent the wheel time after time, especially in the face of the climate crisis. So we hope that more private investors, both individuals and institutions, with a special call for more domestic player participation as well, will be willing to dip their toes into these transactions, as blended finance provides an opportunity for different investor groups just to play to their strengths and work together. Only then can we close the existing funding gaps, address climate change, and ultimately inch closer towards achieving the SDGs by 2030. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Perfect, Claire. Great introduction, really good definition. And, you know, taking from that, we need to be nimble and daring enough, which I think is really important. And in this decade of action, you know, we've got to learn quickly and reiterate to get to really tangible solutions. And on that, John, I'll hand over to you. If you could pick up on that, thank you. Hoping you can unmute.
Yeah, so the host is now unmute myself. Thanks. So thank you, Lisa. And thank you very much, Claire, for that great introduction. I really enjoyed your thoughts, and we have a lot of shared concepts together. My name is John Lane. I work for the Carbon Trust. I'm an associate director there, and I lead our work on energy access, and in particular, the Transforming Energy Access platform. And so I'll come back to that in a little bit, but I think it's very clear that, to me, that the private sector is really important in reaching SDG 7, Sustainable 7, universal access to clean energy by 2030. And so a couple of statistics that kind of underpin that is, you know, the IEA estimates we need 40 billion a year to 2030 for universal access. And so that's an enormous number the public sector can't do alone. And then something I work on, PRIO, the Power and Renewable Energy Opportunities Programme, estimates about 120 billion in a year to unlock the economic opportunities that access provides. And so, and those are the productive use opportunities. So it could be, you know, refrigeration or transport or healthcare or these types of things. And so there's an enormous amount of money that's needed really to reach SDG 7. Of course, the public sector can't do that alone. And so the blending is really important to how we think about that. And so just to go back to transforming energy access. So I'm representing transforming energy access. Energized Africa is a proud member of our family on T, and so I'll come back to that later. But effectively, what T is a research and innovation platform supporting the technologies, business models, and skills needed to enable an inclusive energy transition. And the word there, inclusive, is really important. So it is about universal access. And thank you, Lisa, for inviting me today to talk about the broader context of what the T program does. And so I'll just talk about a little bit about the T program, and then I'll go into some of the things, how we do it. So T program has provided clean energy access to over 10 million people so far. It's raised 600 million in co-finance and avoided 1 million tons of carbon dioxide. And so it's really important to us on this very topic around that leverage number. And so in particular, that the British government investment in T has been 100 million, and we've raised 600 million in money from other parties. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit about how that's happened and the 5 ways that we do that. And so the first way we do it is we invest alongside other donors. And so as part of the T family, we're very happy to have donors such as Shell Foundation, IKEA Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Good Energies Foundation, who are on this call. And Johannes, we really appreciate the support that you've given to Energize Africa, in particular, and other parts of the T program over its time. And so it's really important for us to do that because, you know, once you get other people interested, you kind of feel you're doing the right thing. And so it's really important that donors co-invest together and also don't replicate the work that each other is doing. And so my thanks to those other donors, and particularly Johannes, who's on the call today, for their support. A second way we think about co-finance and blended finance is at a project level. And so we may support some projects, particularly in the demonstration phase, where we expect them to contribute towards the cost of the project. And so we would naturally expect around 50% of a project value to come from the private sector, from the firm we're sponsoring. We'd expect them to use, we would fund half of it and they would fund half of it. And so that's another way we can leverage and blend in a small way private capital into our public capital. And as an important point on this as well is that we want to change that. And so recently in PRIO, for example, my project on productive use, we've said we'll fund 75% of it if it's an African-owned business. And so there's an opportunity there for us, as well as to think about kind of blended finance. Is also trying to work out, well, how can blended finance trying to influence some of the outcomes we're trying to look for, in particular, more African ownership of the project we're doing. The third one I want to talk about is about patient equity. And so we work with a number of investors and grant fund a number of investors to be anchor patient equity investors into pioneer firms. And so we think, pilot companies and pioneer companies are really important in getting this sector moving. And so we will be happily fund kind of patient equity investments and then try and crowd in the private sector alongside that. So hopefully some of those de-risk the private sector investments from an equity perspective alongside the patient equity. The fourth one I want to talk about is what we call market enabling platforms. And so here is where Energized Africa comes front and center. It's been a wonderful experience, I think, for us from a donor perspective to have invested a couple of £1 million or £2-3 million into Energized Africa at the outset, and then have this big return from the private sector in terms of retail investors. And so we are super proud of the work that Lisa and her colleagues have done in terms of being able to deliver that on that promise of real, truly blended finance between, a catalytic investment for the public sector, and then be able to bring on private sector retail investors alongside. And then the last one we think about is pipeline for some of the big large-scale institutional development finance institutes. And so, from our side in the UK, it's CDC. From the American side, it's DFC. I know there's a Dutch equivalent, Johannes, forgive me, that enables them to those companies then to access that kind of scale financing, which is our ultimate objective, enables a company to really go to scale and really make a big impact on the SDG 7 challenge. And so I'm going to finish there, Lisa. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I'm really looking forward to feedback and working with you in the breakout sessions.
Thank you, John. I was just about to hurry you along, but felt very inappropriate doing that just as you were praising Energize Africa. So thank you for that. So we'll be moving on to Sarbinder from P4G. So thank you for your explanation, John, of how UK Aid and the Carbon Trust have contributed to the wonderful work that the T programme has done so far and will continue to do. Sarbinder, on that note, could you introduce us to P4G and your perspectives on blended finance?
Sorry, I was facing a bit of problem with unmuting. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Claire and John. I think you've set up a good base to talk about, blended finance. And let me just give you a brief introduction of P4G. To start with, P4G is a global platform that is involved in accelerating the multi-stakeholder partnerships. Those are involved in implementing innovative and transformative business models And what we are doing is we're targeting 5 SDG areas, which is energy, sustainable cities, food and agriculture, water and sanitation, and circular economy. And how we are doing, where we are doing, we got 12 countries where we're working, out of which 3 are the countries who are supporting us, which is Denmark, Netherlands, and Korea. And where we're working is in LATAM region, it is Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. In Africa, it is Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa. And in Asia, it is Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And what we really do is we provide that catalytic capital to those startups who are implementing those innovative and transformative business models. And we also provide a scale-up catalytic capital to those entities. And this grant is anything between $100K to $1 million, depending on which stage of life cycle the partnership is. But that is one side of it. Providing a funding at a life cycle stage, which is very much early, very much upstream, where nobody will raise hand and say, yeah, I mean, we can provide an investment funding or the commercial funding, because that's not possible. We not only provide that funding at that stage, but work with those partnerships very closely to refine their business model, make it implementable, help them coming over barriers. And to do so, we have established what we call as national platforms in all the countries we're working, both the funding countries as well as the countries where these partnerships are operating. And what effectively national platform means is that there's a representation from a government, and then there's a representation from a private sector. Representation from the government helps with understanding the policy and regulatory framework, and also, getting that kind of support, also a political buy-in. And on the private sector, we get partnerships get access to the market, all the local support they need. So that provides, I won't say very comprehensive, but a very high level, incubation system, or I'll say that ecosystem that helps these partnerships to mature. And where we are is that over last little more than 4 years, we have funded around 70 partnerships. And some of them have actually graduated from being, catalytic fund supported to becoming financially sustainable propositions, achieving their financial closures and getting funding either in still a blended model or, a fully commercial funding or fully, DFI kind of funding. So that is, what we call as a success, the model, which is very much, like startup and idea, innovative and transformative. We start working and then help that whole life cycle to reach up to where DFIs can come and start investing in that. Now, where the blending comes for us is, at the stage, where they are mature enough, but they need more capital. And that's where we still have a gap. We haven't fulfilled that gap, but that's where we want to have, we still handhold with those partnerships so that they can take that next big leap. And with some more, intermediate capital, which is what we are working with some of the DFIs, to set up a separate capital, which we can blend with so that our $1 million can attract maybe a couple of $1 million of investment funding or patience capital and things like that, then the transition will become much smoother. Because DFI, that side of the world, there's abundance of capital. The public funding, the catalytic funding is very limited. The propositions are a lot, the funding is very limited. We get 150 proposals every time we go for a call. But we can only fund maybe 10, 12 models, not more than that. But then even the maturity, there's a success rate is not very high. So if we can blend, what we are doing at the right time, once, some of the basic risks are mitigated, we have seen that some of the models have really done well, that they got some early stage investment funding, which brought its own, I would say, governance and characteristics. And that helped these partnerships to transition from where we, up to the stage we hold hand with them, and then go into what we call as a DFI funding or achieve the financial closures. So, and we've been working with Energize Africa, with Lisa, for more than 2 years. We funded them at a startup level. And over the time, they graduated to scale up. And right now, we're working with them to see, how we can bridge, how we can actually make, Energize Africa that case example where, they're doing even, much, much bigger thing. And the scale, which is visible and has got a more scope. So that is the core of P4G. as I said, I mean, we still see that there is a bridge required, and we still see that a bit more patient capital is required to help move from where, fund like ours, where we are providing that catalytic funding, the partnerships can graduate to the next level where, DFI funding can be made available, or that can be deployed because they have their own parameters and they can't compromise. So I think that is where we are. We're working on it right now, but look forward to work with all of you. But we have seen a success, very clear success, tangible success in some of the business models we have funded over the last 4 years.
Thank you, Zabinder.
So thanks for that.
Perfect, thank you. So I think really important there to be talking about that finance continuum as organizations develop and their needs change, and they do need different levels of support and different types of assistance at various stages in their development. I'm going to hand over to Shah and ask you, Shah, to be brief. If you'd like to give us your perspective.
Yes, thanks, Lisa. Can everybody see the screen that I've got up in front of me?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening. So in terms of what I would like to talk about, it is two areas. The first one is, where does Energize Africa fit into the overall landscape? And the second is Energize Africa's relationship, experience of blended finance, and what we need blended finance to help us do in the future. So in terms of where we fit in the landscape, we basically raise money from personal investors, primarily in the UK, and with that money, we fund working capital requirements of Solar Pago and CNI companies in Southern Africa. Typically, we raise in sterling, and the companies at the moment will pay back in sterling. And we're providing credit facilities to these companies of between 2 and 3 million, and they have the ability to draw down that credit facility in tranches, in loans, typically of between 100 to 200,000 pounds. It's very important to stress that we undertake the due diligence and the investment appraisal of those companies. So in many ways, we are actually acting like a bank as a fund. The only difference is that our funds are the personal balance sheets of our investors. So our investors, in terms of their nature, are individuals. They will invest from a few £100s to many tens of thousands of pounds. They are characterized by being risk tolerant, and also, very importantly, they have a direct relationship, a transparent relationship between the money that they put in and not only the financial return that they're looking to achieve, but also the environmental and social return. That's very important. In terms of our investees, they tend to be younger, less mature companies, maybe with 2 to 3 years track record, with low collateral. And as such, they find it difficult to raise monies in the local fundraising ecosystem from commercial lenders, for example. So we are providing capital at the sort of more risk tolerant early stage of the ecosystem within energy, but also in the future within related sectors as well. I think it's important to stress that we're also part of a larger family. As Lisa mentioned at the top of this webinar, we are a joint venture between FX, which is a UK social investment platform, and Lenderhand, who are a Dutch international impact investment platform. And between the three entities, we've raised the best part of $250 million. FX and Lenderhand have had the privilege of being 8 to 9 years in market, whereas Energize Africa, we've been around since summer of 2017. And in that time, we've raised over 40 million of that 250 million. I think it's important to stress that we believe that crowd lending is a channel which can contribute significantly in the future to meeting, as we all know, the significant SDG funding gap at the sort of smaller, perhaps more risky end of that spectrum. From our perspective, as part of that journey, blended finance is very important. And it has helped to scale and scale in the future, and also to diversify into adjacencies. that we'll go into in the next slide. So I'll just go on to the next slide. It's truly, I think, without blended finance, in particular match funding, working with the likes of John, the T program, the Good Energies Foundation, and Subinda and P4G, then we would not be in a position that we are today as a platform. I think that the match funding in particular that we have received has helped as to be at the point now where we are capable of, I believe, significant growth. That match funding has, as John has alluded to previously, has able to catalyze significant amounts of money. So the 2 to 3 million that in terms of sterling that we received to date has catalyzed in terms of sterling about 30 million pounds. What the match funding was able to do was to create a trust in terms of investors who are willing to look at this type of investment proposition, and also our investees, because they could rely on the fact that the campaigns would be fully funded and would be very successful in that. As we've demonstrated, our expertise has deepened in these particular sectors, and as investors have got more familiar with the investments, then actually the need for match funding in terms of our sort of bread and butter propositions has reduced significantly over the last 4 years. I think that's a very important point, is that we are establishing the credibility of these relatively immature markets as an investable proposition. We've also worked with Good Energies in developing a first-time investor guarantee. And the objective of that was to broaden our customer reach to investors, particularly younger investors who may not invest so much, to introduce this type of investing, particularly with the environmental and social angle attached to the returns that we offer. In the future, we see blended finance as being very important to our growth ambitions. So they really fall into two parts. One is on scale, so taking our existing business model and replicating it. And the key to that is, one of the keys to that is through diversifying, not only offering sterling, but also US dollar and local currency. And we will be piloting in the next quarter, hopefully, a hedged sterling dollar product. And that specifically relies on match funding in terms of a first loss, first gain position that the match funder will take in that model. And it's something that we are very excited about, because we believe that could open up a significant amount of pipeline. I'm working with TCX, and I know Per will talk much more about this, but we're looking to put into market a hedged sterling local currency product, which again will require a guarantee funding in a blended finance instrument. In terms of our sector ambitions, again, so in terms of sectors, so John has mentioned briefly about the funding requirements of productive use, so about 120 billion from the report from last year per year for the next decade. We believe we have the skills, obviously we'll need to also add to our capabilities, but with our investor base is to then diversify into adjacencies, into renewable energy adjacencies and productive use. To do that, we will need to utilize blended finance instruments, particularly maybe partial guarantees and some subordinated debt, because what we're looking to do is perhaps to increase the tenor of our products, and also perhaps to structure the capital repayment structure depending on the cash flow needs of our investees. So in summary, blended finance is an incredibly important set of instruments that we need to retain existing investors, attract new investors, and also to diversify our product line and scale up. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Shah. So introducing there, I think, another aspect of blended finance, where previously we've been talking about, perhaps that catalytic finance being used to kickstart organizations, but then, the next stage being about product development and being able to unlock quite complex systems and support structures that facilitate more money flowing to investees. And I think we'll talk about that a bit more with Per, who will follow us next from TCX. And Per, if I could ask you to be brief in your comments, that would be good. And then we can have a little bit of time for some Q&A at the end with some of those coming in. So Per, over to you.
Yes, Lisa, I'll be as quick as I can. Stopwatch is running. 3 things I'll then say. TCX, we are a global development finance initiative, and we have one role in life, and that is to provide hedging, currency hedging products where the commercial banks do not offer this. We are a blended finance initiative ourselves. We rely on capital from the European Union and 4 donors, Germany, UK, Netherlands and Swiss governments, which provide close to half of our capital, which is 1.5 billion. Without that capital, it would have been impossible to get the DFIs involved, the IFC, FMO, DBSA, and all of the others that you see here. That would have been impossible. Even more so, there's also a number of private sector specialized lenders that are shareholders in TCX. What we do is we de-risk international financing flows, so we eliminate the currency risk from financing that comes from DFIs, impact lenders into emerging and frontier markets, where that used to be pushed, the currency used to be pushed onto borrowers because there was no alternative. We, together with the lending community, now offer an alternative such that lenders can always lend in local currency for any required tenor, and TCX takes the hedge in the background. There are two other concrete examples of blending that we are looking to deploy and already deploying in product development. One is what relates to Energize Africa and relates to lender hand. When a hedge provider like us, same to a bank, under universal regulation, when we transact with other counterparties, collateral is a requirement, it's a must-have. That doesn't work when you transact with a crowdfunding platform because the investors is not a lender, but well, it's not a lending institution, but individual investors in the platform is just a pass-through. We built a structure tailor-made for lender hand, so the Dutch joint venture partner of Energize Africa, that allows us to provide a hedge to the platform such that the platform can lend in any local currency. That pilot has started. We did the first transaction in Ghana last year, and we're looking to build that out very soon with Energize Africa. So what we're then together are creating is local currency lending capacity for crowdfunding platforms, while the retail investors continue to have a guaranteed euro or dollar return. Blending comes in because the platforms cannot provide security in case something goes wrong. That function is now transferred completely to a third party, a donor in this case, which is willing to do that without having significant return expectations. So that's blending makes that possible. It would not have been possible otherwise, certainly not when, as Shah says, we're looking to scale this to very substantial scale, which is our expectation and hope. And we also have strong belief in the crowdfunding as becoming a really important alternative source of development finance. The second area where we are actively looking to deploy blending is in making local currency somewhat more affordable. We all know that there's an interest rate difference between dollar rates and local currency rates, which are to reflect the higher risk or the risk in the currency. It is not expensive per se, if you look at it from a risk point of view, but that argument sort of breaks down where you're talking to an individual borrower who's faced with an opportunity to borrow at 6% in dollars and 16% in local currency. Such a borrower will always be tempted, incentivized nearly, to take the dollar and just hope for the best, hope that the local currency doesn't depreciate too much, in which case you will be saving money. That is the kind of behavior that builds very weak and vulnerable sectors. We've seen it before in the microfinance sector 20, 30 years ago, and that's exactly what we want to avoid when building the off-grid sector. A local currency generating sector, which should be financed in local currency, but there is this issue of interest rate differential and borrowers being tempted to take the dollar. To narrow the gap between dollar funding and local currency funding, we have developed a program, launched it and implemented it last year with the European Union, which is mostly used by financial sector counterparties and borrowers. But we're working on a similar program that will be designed exclusively for the energy sector off-grid energy sector in Africa, again, with the objective to make local currency lending somewhat more attractive and to eliminate speculation by borrowers taking dollars. That will be it for now, Lisa.
Thank you, Per. Very helpful. Great to have a deep dive into some of that product-related challenges around some of the climate finance and some of the solutions, pragmatic solutions that you're working on. So finally, we're going to turn to Johannes from Good Energies Foundation. We are running a bit over schedule on the presentations, so if you could be brief, Johannes, and then I've got some questions primed and ready for us in the chat. So over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Senkalp and Energize Africa for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here. So my name is Johannes, and I'm managing the Good Energies Foundation based here out of Switzerland. And we have a dual focus. On the one hand, accelerating the clean energy transition in Africa and in India. And on the other hand, on tropical forest and management, and with a big focus on the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin, and then Indonesia and Papua, both to stop tropical deforestation and to increase restoration, reforestation. And I'm eager to elaborate here briefly on how we see blended finance and also to give some examples on what's working and what we see is still missing in this space. So venture philanthropy is very much part of our DNA, as we are backed by a family of business entrepreneurs active in retail, real estate, clean energy, and private equity. So it's in their DNA to understand, to get proof of concepts in new businesses and in building new markets. And for us, blended finance is therefore all about unlocking more public funding and de-risking more private funding. And that is always easier said than done. And therefore, I think philanthropy has a very important role to play in this field. I think on the one hand, it's to test and incubate new ideas. And on the other hand, getting proof of concept via pilots and experimentation on convening and bringing the key stakeholders and experts together. Hardly anybody is doing this. And to provide some technical assistance to build the backbone of local institutional capacity of local organizations. And our experience in Africa so far has been very exciting. And let me highlight a few examples. I think our first entry was almost 2 decades ago with the Clinton Global Initiative in bringing off-grid solar to remote areas of Ethiopia. And this, in the end, paved the way to launching the Lightning Africa program of the IVC and the World Bank. It's a good example, I think, where philanthropy paved the road for much bigger multilateral commitments there. And then later on, we got deeply involved in launching the so-called Energy Access Practitioners Network, which I think was the first to make the case that energy access does not really depend on the grid, right? And I think this was extremely important and created a lot of goodwill and eventually contributed to the adoption of the SDG 7 on sustainable energy. And then more recently, we've been funding Clean Star Ventures, which is now called COCO Networks in Kenya and Uganda via convertible grants, right? Help to develop a proprietary bioethanol cook stoves and fuel delivery systems that are linked to stopping charcoal production in the Congo Basin. And then I think our role as a philanthropy was not just to give money, but really to participate in board meetings and networking, opening doors to new investors and advise them on ownership models and also to safeguard the original mission to launch it more. And then more recently, we teamed up with Energized Africa, right, through a grant for first loss and matches for enterprise loans. And I think I should also mention a partnership with the Energy Peace Partners. I think it's another good example. They are working at the intersection of energy poverty, conflict risk, and peace building and climate. And they have launched these peace renewable energy credits, the PRECs. And this is to really promote clean energy in conflict zones. And last but not least, perhaps highlighting the work we do with Celco, in which we own a large equity stake. It's really to replicate and roll out energy models through their global SDG 7 hubs. I think alongside the United Nations, the UNHCR, we want to solarize refugee camps, right? How to make refugees and migration flows less dependent on diesel generators. And also with the World Health Organization to really solarize cold chains for the vaccine rollout in for the pandemic. Lisa, I can go on, but I think the rest I can better do in the breakout sessions, right?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Johannes. Thanks everyone for your initial comments, and great to see a wide range of participation there, Johannes. So just a couple of questions, and then as we're a bit behind schedule, we'll go straight into our breakout room. So first up, question for Shah. In raising private money, do we see concessionally coming from private investors towards climate-friendly investments? In other words, what's the return expectation that personal investors have, and the ticket size range for the crowd lending model?
Oh, thank you for the question. Just in terms of the ticket size, so working it backwards, if the investee, if the company is looking to raise, say, a bond of £250,000, then we would raise £250,000 from individual personal investors. So that could range from literally somebody putting in £100, £200 to £10,000, £15,000, £20,000. So in terms of the investment per person, it's very variable, but on average, it's around £1,250 on average per investor. And our typical average loan at the moment is around 250,000 sterling. In terms of the return expectation, so the term of the debt is typically 2 to 4 years, and it is repayable semi-annually, capital interest. And the return will vary depending on what we assess the risk to be, but it's typically between 5.5%, 6% to 6.5%, 7% in terms of sterling.
Thank you, Shah. And question for Johannes, I think. Are there any concerns regarding subsidizing commercial capital with philanthropic capital, and any particular structuring solutions that you've used to address that?
Thank you, Lisa, for the question. I think it's important for regulatory and legal requirements. We cannot front load any businesses, right, or seen as self-loading. That's important, but I think the biggest focus for us is not really the scarcity of capital. It's really focusing on the barriers in this space, and I think the barriers that need to be overcome for blended finance, they need to be more widely invested in. It's often very unclear what is the investment case. It's often unclear. There's a lack of network, and investors often struggle to identify the usual suspects they have to focus on.
Thank you. Sarbinder, any different perspective from you?
No, I agree with what was just said. And this is what we've seen. I mean, like one side, we work with DFIs who've got very defined parameters under which they come and invest. And on the other side, we're working in this whole innovative propositions where the risk is very high. And where we have been able to achieve some success, where this transition has happened very, I won't call it smoothly, but some steps were taken by the DFIs who participated in those partnerships, and some steps were taken by us. So one side, we were able to mitigate some of the policy and regulatory risks by bringing those changes in that environment, in that ecosystem, where that particular business model can be launched. And once that particular risk was mitigated, it became a business case for investment. But still, there was no precedence. So when DFIs came, they considered it very risky. And that's where we started working with them hand in hand. And where it landed is they did get financing, And there was a period when there was like a parallel financing, which means we were still working with the partnership and some of the investment money came. But the business case also for that particular partnership changed substantially during that period. And that's where that bridge was built. Finally, they achieved the second close and they became financially sustainable. So we have over the period of time now good understanding about what risks need to be mitigated and what is a transition period. So that's where when we start talking to DFIs, but it's only progressive DFIs who actually come in that space, and then where they can come and say, yes, now this is good, and we can do our regular investments in this. So we have done that. We've done that in few partnerships, and that's a model we're trying to now mainstream it.
Thanks, Sabinder. Okay, so we have come to the part of the discussion where we are going to attempt to break out everyone into discussion rooms. And as I mentioned previously, there are 3 different rooms. You have been randomly allocated a room. If you find yourself in a room that you don't want to be in, you can choose to go back to the main room and be reallocated. There will be some hosts from Energize Africa in each of the rooms, and if we could have a scribe and someone to nominate feeding back when we come back to the main room, that would be excellent. And I think we will, in the interests of time, we will hope to come back to the main room at about 3:15-ish. And then we'll have some feedback and then we'll round up. So let's see how we go. So if the organisers could do their allocation, that would be excellent. And if everyone could just hold on to their hats and hope this works, that would be excellent.
Hi, Lisa. Can we just say in how many minutes we will be back, because everyone is in different time zones?
Aha, good point. So I think we should allocate ourselves 15 minutes for this breakout. So I think everyone is just joining us again. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming back to the main room. We are going to quickly summarize some of the discussions in the breakout rooms. And Laura has kindly agreed to be our leader for the first breakout room, which was innovative blended finance approaches to de-risking emerging markets investments. And we had a general conversation in that room. Laura, would you like to?
Yes, thanks, Lisa, and thanks, John. So there's a lot more to discuss. We had a pretty brief discussion, but largely around blended finance in terms of what do we need for blended finance to scale and for it to really be effective. And there, a lot of the conversation focused on sort of public and philanthropic funding and the need for a larger or higher appetite for risk. So sometimes, while we expect public funders to be sort of embracing risk and really coming in where others cannot, sometimes there's still not really an acceptance that some programs might fail. If there's no failures, then there's no risk really either. And also that if philanthropic funding isn't for testing and innovating and sometimes having these failures, then it's a little bit unclear what it is for. We also heard about ODA funding and how much that's focused on still technical assistance, capacity building, and policy rather than entrepreneurship. But also that there's some successful examples of kind of merging policy and regulation and entrepreneurship. For example, the Africa Green Co in Zambia. And then in addition to risk, one of the other elements that's needed in blended finance is flexibility. So some funders are quite rigid, due to different constraints in how they deploy capital. And often then there's a need for more flexible financiers to come in to sort of really enable things to get started. And then we also briefly heard from DFCD about sort of ways to take more risk by sort of taking a more gradual approach. So giving smaller grants at the beginning before then recipients sort of graduate to blended finance. And then as we were discussing emerging markets and international development, international markets, there's also a real need to make sure that the recipients of blended finance, or the borrowers, are representative of those emerging markets, and so that we're really working internationally with diverse enterprises. So that's kind of the brief summary of a conversation that can be continued for sure.
Thank you, Laura. Excellent roundup there. Right, moving to breakout room 2, where we were talking about developing patient and affordable local currency and USD lending mechanisms. Do we have someone who is going to be reporting back from that group? Oh, sorry. I have to, yes. How's that? Thank you. Sorry, Per.
No, it's okay. Yeah, we had a discussion. I can debrief. There were a few questions, and then I responded to them. So I did probably too much talking. I brought out 1 or 2 sort of interesting things. The question is about, affordable local currency. 2 questions basically centering around price. And there's 2 things. I responded to that, and it is actually interesting because it also reflects evolving thinking on our part over the past 10 years. There's 2 things. One is the risk of currency volatility in African markets, for example. And the other thing is the willingness of a borrower. And in the energy access sector, borrowers are free to choose. They're not financially regulated. So a borrower, a mini-grid company, a home systems company, when offered a loan, can choose between dollars and local currency. And that's the other thing. His willingness to take on a local currency loan, not dollars, lock in security instead of taking risk, depends on his willingness, his decision making. So you have, on the one hand, you have the risk, a hedged cost that we pass on to a lender that translates to a local currency loan. It has a certain price, which is a fair price and reflects actual risk. And we can argument that and motivate it and show it on basis of empirical evidence and looking to historical volatility and shocks till we're blue in the face. But the fact is that for individual borrowers faced with a choice between hard currency loans and local currency loans, that's all sort of becomes irrelevant. He needs to make a decision on the spot between a higher priced local currency loan with no risk or a lower priced dollar loan with less risk. And I think that's also what was brought out in the discussion, is that and that's what I meant with the evolving thinking. We've initially always said, well, that's the price of the risk, and it's the right price. And if a borrower, any sensible and prudent borrower, should just take the local currency because it's the right price. But that's just not what happens in practice. And that's also a real consideration that we need to factor in. And if we want to build, in this case, an energy access sector that is resilient and sustainable, and that over time will succeed in attracting funding at more affordable funding rates, then we have to encourage borrowers to take local currency, and reduced hedge rates using blended instruments is going to be essential to achieve it. So I think that was sort of, that was one element that came up. And there was one other question about why is local currency from domestic sources, from local financial institutions, still not happening at scale. And I think we observed there are many programs that are designed to achieve that. Recently, the African Development Bank LEAF program, which is designed to catalyze $800 million of debt on the back of guarantees. I think that many of these initiatives, it still doesn't happen. Answer is, but I think it has to do with banks that have lots of other high yielding alternatives and still are unfamiliar with the sector. But it's not really we didn't really have the time to explore that further, but that is a question out there. why that is not happening and why there's still such great reliance on offshore local currency funding. Anyway, so that was sort of the gist of our session.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Per. And session 3, that was looking at carbon finance. Shah?
Yeah, so very briefly, so we associated carbon finance as carbon credits. And we felt that that then split into 2. So in terms of the demand, we felt that there was growing and increasingly robust demand for carbon credits, but the issue was on the supply side and providing a decent, well-regulated market, a decent, well-regulated environment that creates high-quality carbon credits that people can rely on. And Johannes came up with a nice acronym, CLEAN, which I thought was for clean carbon credits. So the C is for catalytic, the L is for local jobs, the E is for empowering and net zero, although I'm not sure where E is of net, but empowering. A is for additional finance, and N is for nature positive. I think that behind this was also the accent on the local, but also on the equitable distribution of the carbon revenue, the carbon credit revenues, so that the end customers, the people of the localities actually benefit, rather than, as somebody politely said, cowboys in various cities in the West. So that was my first takeaway. The second takeaway I had was that we felt that blended finance had a role to play in the creation of these markets, the scaling up of these markets. The phrase coalition of the willing was used, and I think that comes back to a very similar point, that in terms of, for example, ourselves and the crowd lending side, it's about having initial high-risk capital to actually create these markets. And the objective in the carbon markets would be to create an enabling environment that allows for well-regulated carbon credits. In particular, we felt that that technology perhaps would also play a role in being able to provide sector solutions, as the cost of technology in terms of monitoring of the outputs falls. So yeah, so we felt that there was definitely a significant opportunity, and that blended finance had a role to play in creating those markets.
Thank you, Shah. So some very high-level discussions regarding uses and risk-taking and appetite of different players within the markets, whether that's public or private, down to, you know, detailed discussions around the nuances of product development and risk alleviation, and making the products attractive to investees, but also ensuring you know, this just transition, and that it's very inclusive, and that we are helping entrepreneurs on the ground to expand and develop their businesses for this climate positive effect that we're all working hard to achieve. So on that note, I apologize for not having longer within the discussion groups. I think that would be really great to carry on in some format. Thank you all for joining. I think this has been an excellent group of leaders within the blended finance arena. There's so much more to be done. There's so much potential. And I really welcome and look forward to further discussions with you all in the coming weeks and months ahead. So thank you all, and thank you to our organisers for this session today. It's been excellent. Thank you all. Have a good evening and afternoon. Thanks very much.